Welcome to Heart Over Gold, the channel where love, kindness, and humanity shine brighter than any fortune. In today's story, at 32, Edward Sullivan had achieved his dream, professional success and financial security, after landing a game-changing project in Sydney. But as he arrived at Heathrow, he realized something was missing. When he unexpectedly crossed paths with Charlotte Hayes, the woman he once loved, and saw the child she had kept from him, his world shifted. Lily, with her piercing green eyes, was his daughter. And suddenly, everything Edward thought he wanted seemed insignificant compared to the family he'd lost. Now, he must confront his past and fight for a future he never imagined. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest stories. Prepare yourself for an emotional tale filled with ambition, regret, and the extraordinary ways love finds its way back when least expected. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share in the comments the most unexpected coincidence that changed the course of your life. The fluorescent lights at Heathrow buzzed softly overhead, casting an almost clinical glow as Edward Sullivan pushed his luggage through the crowded arrivals hall. His mind was still swirling with the aftermath of his latest success, a game-changing project in Sydney. After 6 weeks of relentless negotiations and sleepless nights, Sullivan Design Group had finally landed the contract for a monumental $15 million sustainable housing development. At 32, he was living his dream, but somehow it didn't feel as fulfilling as it should have. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from colleagues and clients congratulating him on the win, but Edward barely glanced at them. The fatigue weighed on him like a heavy cloak he couldn't shed. All he wanted was to get back to his lonely Chelsea flat, pour a drink, and forget why his success felt so empty without anyone to share it with. Then, he saw her. Charlotte Hayes stood by the busy ticket kiosk, her auburn hair glowing under the harsh airport lights, gleaming like copper. She wore a simple, well-loved blue dress that molded to her familiar figure, and in her arms, she held something that sent Edward's world spinning, an infant wrapped in a soft pink blanket, tiny hands reaching out in curiosity. Edward froze, his luggage slipping from his grip. 16 months. It had been exactly 16 months since their emotional breakup. When Charlotte had walked out, tears streaming down her face, leaving behind harsh words he still heard in his darkest moments. The baby in her arms was around 10 or 11 months old, with a tuft of dark, soft hair and glowing skin. The infant turned her head slowly, as though sensing Edward's gaze, and his heart skipped a beat before it thundered painfully in his chest. The eyes. Green. Not just any green, but the rare, piercing emerald shade that had skipped generations in his family, finally settling in his own face, the very same eyes his beloved grandmother had possessed, eyes so unique that strangers often commented on them. And now, they were staring back at him from Charlotte's child. "Charlotte!" he called out, his voice cracking with disbelief and an emotion he couldn't fully comprehend. She turned quickly at the sound of her name, and Edward could see the color drain from her face as she caught sight of him. For a suspended moment, neither of them moved. The baby cooed happily, blissfully unaware of the tension filling the space, her tiny fingers stretching toward the overhead lights. "Edward!" Charlotte breathed, instinctively pulling the baby closer to her chest in a protective gesture. "What are you doing here?" "I just returned from Sydney," he managed to say, his eyes still fixed on the child. Charlotte's expression shifted, and her voice grew sharper with urgency. "We need to go," she said quickly, grabbing the baby bag slung over her shoulder. "Come on, Lily, let's find Daddy." Lily. The baby's name was Lily. Edward's heart ached as he watched Charlotte try to move past him, desperation evident in her every motion. "Wait," he said, stepping into her path, blocking her way. "Please, just wait a minute." "There's nothing to discuss, Edward," Charlotte replied, her voice cold and defensive, like a shield she couldn't lower. "We're meeting someone." But Edward didn't hear her. He was studying Lily's face, as if trying to decode a blueprint, examining every feature with intense focus. The nose was unmistakably Charlotte's, small and slightly turned up, but the chin carried the stubborn, determined angle of the Sullivan family. The hands were long, graceful, just like his mother's, and those eyes. "How old is she?" Edward asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "That's none of your business," Charlotte responded, her tone tight. "Charlotte, please," he pleaded. "Those eyes." "She has my grandmother's eyes." For a brief moment, Charlotte's composure cracked, and Edward saw a flash of fear before it was quickly hidden behind a wall of indifference. "Lots of babies have green eyes, Edward," she said, her voice tinged with dismissiveness. "It doesn't mean anything." "No," Edward insisted, his voice unwavering. Not like these. These eyes are rare. They run in my family. My grandmother had them. I have them. And now, he gestured helplessly to Lily, who was watching him with wide-eyed curiosity. Stop. Charlotte cut him off sharply, her voice strained. Just stop. You made your choice 16 months ago when you said a family would ruin everything you'd worked for. You chose your career over us. Edward flinched, the words hitting him like blows, each one digging deeper. That's not what I said, he protested. I wanted to wait until we were financially secure. I never said I didn't want— Your exact words were, a baby right now would ruin everything I've built, Charlotte interrupted, her voice rising before she caught herself, glancing nervously at the onlookers. And then you took that job in Sydney without even talking to me. I took that job because it was supposed to set us up for life. Edward's frustration flared. The money from that project was going to secure our future, buy us a house. I was doing it for us, Charlotte. No, she shot back. You were doing it for you. Everything was always about your timeline, your dreams, your plans. Well, guess what? Life doesn't wait for your perfect moment. At that moment, Lily let out a joyful squeal, reaching toward Edward with her chubby arms, as if there were something familiar about him. Her innocent gesture broke through the heated tension like a ray of sunlight. Both adults paused in surprised silence, looking down at her. She likes you, Charlotte murmured softly, her voice betraying a hint of awe. Edward cautiously extended a finger, and Lily immediately grasped it with surprising strength. A jolt of connection shot through him, an unspoken bond he'd never known but somehow recognized. Charlotte, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Is she mine? For a long moment, Charlotte said nothing, but Edward could see the conflict in her eyes. Finally, she gently removed Lily's hand from his finger. It doesn't matter, Edward, she said, her voice flat and emotionless. Even if she were, what difference would it make? You made it clear you weren't ready for this. That was then, Edward replied urgently. Everything's different now. The success in Sydney, the company, we could have everything we wanted. Charlotte laughed bitterly, a sound void of humor. There is no we, Edward. Not anymore. You saw to that. I don't even know where to start. Might I suggest you start with the truth? Arthur said gently, his voice kind but firm. About what you really want, about what you're willing to sacrifice for it, and about whether you're finally ready to put someone else's needs before your own ambitions. With that, Arthur Hayes turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing utterly alone in the middle of Heathrow Airport. The immense weight of newfound fatherhood settling on his shoulders like a heavy, unexpected mantle he wasn't sure he was ready to wear. As he finally picked up his fallen luggage and made his way toward the exit, Edward couldn't shake the vivid image of those green eyes, his grandmother's eyes staring at him from his daughter's face. Lily Rose Hayes Sullivan, his daughter. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, a dizzying blend of fear and profound, undeniable joy. By the time he reached his car, Edward Sullivan had made a decision that would change everything. He was going to fight for his daughter, and if it was still possible, for the woman he'd never truly stopped loving. The only question now was whether 16 months of bitter hurt and devastating misunderstanding could ever truly be overcome, or if he was already too late. What do you think of Arthur's revelation? And is Edward truly ready to fight for a family he once pushed away? Share your thoughts below. Part 3. Seeking Absolution. Edward sat in his sleek Chelsea penthouse, staring at his phone for the 100th time that evening. 3 days had passed since the airport encounter, and Lily's face, those unmistakable green eyes, haunted his every waking moment, shattering his carefully constructed world of success and solitude. His finger hovered over Charlotte's contact information, which he'd never had the strength to delete. Every time he started to dial, he imagined her hanging up the moment she heard his voice. A silent, painful rejection. The conversation with Arthur Hayes played on repeat in his mind. Lily Rose Hayes Sullivan, his daughter, carried his name, even if the world didn't know it. The doorbell interrupted his brooding. Liam Miller, his best friend since university and now a successful family lawyer, stood in the hallway holding a bottle of whiskey and wearing an expression of deep concern. "You look like hell, mate," Liam observed, pushing past Edward into the minimalist living room. "When you called yesterday, you sounded like someone had died." "Someone was born?" Edward replied grimly, accepting the glass Liam poured for him. "A someone I knew nothing about." Liam settled into the leather armchair across from him. "Tell me everything." So Edward did. He recounted every excruciating detail of the airport encounter, every sharp word exchanged, every overwhelming moment of recognition when he looked into Lily's eyes. Liam listened without interruption, his lawyer's mind already dissecting the implications, weighing the possibilities. "You're certain she's yours?" Liam asked when Edward finished, his voice gentle. "Those eyes don't lie. They're a genetic marker in my family going back generations. My great-grandmother had them. My grandmother had them. I have them. And now Lily does too." Edward ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "The timing fits perfectly. Charlotte and I broke up 16 months ago, and Lily looks about 10 months old. Have you tried contacting Charlotte directly? I've drafted a dozen messages and deleted them all. She made it clear at the airport that she wants nothing to do with me." Edward stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the London skyline. "Liam, what are my legal rights here? If Lily is your biological daughter, you have the right to seek paternity testing and pursue custody arrangements." "But, Edward," Liam's voice carried a warning, "family court battles are brutal, especially when there's this much bad blood between the parents. It would be far better to resolve this amicably." "How can I resolve anything when she won't even talk to me?" Liam was quiet for a moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass, contemplating. "There might be another way. Charlotte has a sister, doesn't she? Grace Davies." "Grace Hayes Davies," Edward corrected. "She's a nurse at St. Thomas's Hospital. She and Charlotte were always close." He paused, hope flickering in his chest. "You think she might talk to me? It's worth a try. Sometimes a neutral family member can bridge gaps that seem impossible to cross." Part 4. Confronting the past, building the future. The next morning, Edward found himself in the bustling cafeteria of St. Thomas's Hospital, nursing a cup of terrible coffee and waiting, heart-pounding, for Grace's shift to end. When she finally appeared, still in her blue scrubs, her expression shifted from surprise to a guarded weariness. "Edward Sullivan," she said, sliding into the seat across from him, her voice cool. "I wondered when you'd turn up, Grace. I need to know the truth about Lily." Grace studied his face for a long moment, her eyes piercing. "What truth would that be? Is she my daughter? Does it matter? You weren't there when Charlotte needed you most." The words stung, a painful reminder, but Edward pressed on, desperate for answers. "I was in Sydney, closing the biggest deal of my career. I had no idea Charlotte was pregnant." "Because you never gave her the chance to tell you." Grace shot back, her voice sharper now. "The night you two broke up, she was planning to share the news. She just found out that afternoon. But before she could say anything, you launched into that self-absorbed speech about how a family would destroy your carefully laid plans." Edward felt the blood drain from his face, a cold dread washing over him. "She was going to tell me that night. She had the pregnancy test in her purse. Edward, she was terrified, but excited, ready to figure it out together. Then you made it crystal clear that a baby was the last thing you wanted. So when you took the Sydney job 2 weeks later without even discussing it with her, she made a decision. She would handle the pregnancy alone rather than trap you in a life you clearly didn't want." Edward buried his face in his hands, a guttural groan escaping his lips. "God, what have I done?" Grace's expression softened slightly, a hint of empathy in her eyes. "You were both young and scared. Charlotte was terrified of being a burden, and you were so singularly focused on success that you couldn't see what was right in front of you." "Tell me about Lily," Edward pleaded, his voice thick with raw emotion. "Tell me about my daughter." Grace hesitated, then seemed to make a decision, her gaze softening further. "She was born on May 20th at 3:42 in the morning. Autin Labdios. Charlotte was in labor for 18 hours, and she was alone, except for Dad and me. You were in Sydney celebrating your contract signing at some fancy restaurant. If I remember the photos correctly." The timeline hit Edward like a physical blow, a devastating punch to the gut. While he was toasting his professional success, Charlotte was bringing their daughter into the world without him, suffering alone. "Lily is remarkable," Grace continued, her voice warming with pride. "She's ahead of all her developmental milestones. She started sitting up at 5 months, crawling at 6. She has Charlotte's fierce determination and insatiable curiosity." But Edward Grace paused, meeting his eyes directly, a significant look. "She has your family's intelligence. I can see it in the way she studies everything, the way she problem solves even simple tasks. And those eyes of yours, they're windows to a very bright soul." "What's her full name?" Edward asked quietly, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Lily Rose Hayes Sullivan," Grace confirmed. Charlotte insisted on the Sullivan surname, even though she told everyone it was just Hayes. She said Lily deserved to know where she came from, even if her father chose his career over his family. "I never chose my career over family," Edward said desperately, a burning ache in his chest. "I was trying to build something stable for us. Everything I did was supposed to be for our future together." "Then why didn't you fight for her when she left?" The question hung in the air like a heavy, undeniable accusation, a truth he couldn't escape. Edward had asked himself the very same question countless times over the past 16 months, tortured by the unanswered query. Pride, he admitted finally, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. Stupid, destructive pride. I thought if she could walk away so easily, then maybe we weren't meant to be. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that didn't hurt. Grace leaned back in her chair, studying him, a thoughtful expression on her face. Charlotte thinks you've forgotten all about her. She sees your success in the papers, your projects, your awards. She thinks you got exactly what you wanted, a life free from the complications of family. I'd give it all up, Edward said without hesitation, the words pouring out from a place of profound conviction. Every contract, every award, every pound in the bank. I'd give it all up for one chance to hold my daughter, to be the father she deserves. Would you really? Grace asked, her voice skeptical, testing him. Because being a parent isn't about grand gestures, Edward. It's about 3 hours a.m., feedings and nappy changes and putting someone else's needs before your own every single day without a break. Yes, Edward said firmly, his gaze unwavering. I want all of it. The sleepless nights, the worry, their responsibility. I want to be her father. Not just biologically, but in every way that matters. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone. Charlotte won't talk to you directly, but she might listen if the message comes through me. What should I say? Start with the truth. Tell her what you just told me, all of it. Do you think Charlotte will read the message? And what kind of challenges do you foresee if Edward tries to become a father now? Share your thoughts below. Part 5, A Father's Plea. That evening, Edward found himself in his spacious home office, staring at a blank email draft, the cursor blinking mockingly. How do you even begin to apologize for missing the birth of your own child? How do you explain that every professional success, every triumphant deal felt utterly hollow without the people you love to share it with? Finally, with a heavy sigh, he began typing, the words flowing from his heart, raw and unfiltered. Charlotte, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I can't stop thinking about Lily. Grace told me about the night we broke up, about how you were planning to tell me about the pregnancy. I need you to know that I never ever would have walked away if I had known. When I said I wanted to wait for the right time to start a family, I wasn't rejecting the idea. I was trying to be responsible. I grew up watching my father work himself to death trying to provide for us, and I swore I'd do better. I wanted to give you and our children everything, including a father who wouldn't have to miss bedtime stories because he was working late to make ends meet. I was wrong. There is no perfect time, no ideal circumstances. There's only love and commitment and the willingness to figure it out together. I should have trusted us enough to believe we could handle anything as long as we faced it as a team. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect you to welcome me back into your life. But Lily is my daughter too, and she deserves to know her father. Not the successful businessman the papers write about, but the man who would give up everything for the chance to read her bedtime stories and teach her to ride a bicycle. Please, Charlotte, give me a chance to prove that I'm ready to be the father Lily needs and the partner you deserved all along. All my love. He sent the email to Grace with a simple message. Please give this to her when you think she's ready to read it. 2 days later, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was achingly familiar, soft, uncertain. Edward. Charlotte. He breathed, his voice filled with overwhelming relief. Thank you for calling. Grace gave me your message. She also told me what you said about giving up everything for Lily. I meant every word. There was a long, tense pause. Lily has been asking about you. Edward's heart stopped, then pounded with a sudden, fierce hope. Asking about me? She's too young for words, but ever since the airport, she's been looking for you. She stares at the door like she's expecting someone. Grace thinks she recognized something familiar about you. Can I see her? Edward asked, hardly daring to hope, his voice barely a whisper. Charlotte's voice caught a flicker of vulnerability. I'm scared, Edward. What if you decide this isn't what you want? What if you realize that being a father is harder than you thought? I can't let Lily get attached to you only to have you disappear again. I won't disappear, Edward promised, his voice firm, unwavering. I'll prove it to you every single day for the rest of my life if I have to. Another long pause filled with unspoken anxieties. There's a park near my flat, Regent's Park. Lily and I go there most afternoons around 4 how. I'll be there, Edward said immediately. A surge of adrenaline. Edward, Charlotte said quietly, her voice tinged with a painful finality. This doesn't fix everything between us. Too much has happened for that, but Lily deserves to know her father. I understand, Edward replied, though his heart was breaking at the absolute finality in her voice. Thank you for giving me this chance. After hanging up, Edward sat in his office, staring out at the London skyline. Tomorrow, he would see his daughter again. Tomorrow, he would begin the long journey of earning his place in her life. For the first time in 16 months, Edward Sullivan felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope, Part 6. First steps on a new path. Edward arrived at Regent's Park 30 minutes early, his palms sweating as he sat on a bench overlooking the serene lake. He'd barely slept the night before, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. What if Lily didn't remember him? What if Charlotte changed her mind? What if he proved to be the disaster of a father he'd always feared he might become? At exactly 4 he spotted them. Charlotte pushed a navy blue pram along the winding path, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sunlight, shimmering with a soft, warm glow. She wore jeans and a simple white jumper, looking younger and more relaxed than she had at the airport. As she drew closer, Edward could see Lily sitting up in her pram, alert, anxious about her surroundings. "Hello, Edward," Charlotte said softly as she approached his bench. "Thank you for coming," he replied, standing awkwardly, feeling a surge of nervous energy. "You look wonderful." Charlotte's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. Lily was excited about her walk today. I think she somehow knew it was special. Edward looked down at his daughter, and his breath caught in his throat. Lily was even more beautiful than he remembered, with plump rosy cheeks and dark hair that curled softly at the ends. She wore a pink dress with tiny flowers and matching shoes that looked barely worn. But it was her eyes that captivated him completely. Those distinctive green eyes that marked her unmistakably as his. "Hello, Lily," he said softly, crouching down to her level, his voice filled with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. Lily studied him intently for a long moment, those remarkable eyes focused entirely on his face, observing every detail. Then, to both parents' profound amazement, she reached out her chubby arms toward him and made a sound that was unmistakably happy recognition, a joyful coo. "She remembers you," Charlotte whispered, genuine surprise and a hint of wonder in her voice. "May I?" Edward asked, gesturing tentatively toward Lily, his heart pounding. Charlotte hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Be careful with her head." With trembling hands, Edward gently lifted his daughter from her pram. Lily settled into his arms as if she belonged there, one tiny fist gripping his shirt, while the other explored his face with the focused intensity of a miniature scientist. When her small fingers touched his cheek, Edward felt something fundamental shift inside him, a fierce, protective love unlike anything he'd ever experienced, an anchor dropping deep within his soul. "She's perfect," he breathed, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "Shays," Charlotte agreed, a soft smile gracing her lips. And for a moment, the tension that had lingered between them faded, replaced by a shared warmth as they both watched Lily babble happily in her father's arms. Utterly content, they spent the next hour walking around the tranquil lake, Lily content to observe the world from Edward's arms, while her parents tentatively began to rebuild the fragile bridges that had been burned 16 months ago. Edward asked endless questions about Lily's routine, her favorite foods, her sleeping patterns, her toys, absorbing every detail. Charlotte found herself sharing stories she'd kept locked away, intimate moments only she had witnessed. Lily's first radiant smile, the way she giggled when tickled, how she loved to splash in the bath, recounting them with a growing ease. "She's incredibly advanced," Edward observed, as Lily demonstrated her ability to clap her hands and wave goodbye to passing ducks. A natural, joyful performer. "The health visitor says she's in the 95th percentile for cognitive development," Charlotte said with evident pride. "She's already trying to pull herself up to standing and she can say mama and baba clearly." "What about Dada?" Edward asked, a hopeful, vulnerable note in his voice. Charlotte's expression tightened slightly. "She doesn't. I haven't taught her that word." The sharp reminder of his absence hit Edward like a physical blow, a fresh wound, but he pushed through the pain. "I understand. I have a lot to make up for." Over the following weeks, Edward began to restructure his entire life around newfound fatherhood. He declined lucrative international projects, delegated travel to his partners, and meticulously blocked out his calendar every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday afternoon for what he privately called Lily time. Their meetings always took place in neutral public locations, lively parks, soft play areas filled with children's laughter, family-friendly cafes. Charlotte was always present, a silent observer at first, then slowly a cautious participant. Edward brought age-appropriate gifts, soft, colorful books, stacking toys that challenged her growing mind, a musical teddy bear that quickly became Lily's absolute favorite. He learned to change nappies with the same precision he once reserved for complex architectural blueprints, mastered the subtle art of warming bottles to the perfect temperature, and discovered to his utter astonishment that making Lily laugh was more profoundly satisfying than any professional achievement he had ever attained. You're good with her, Charlotte admitted one afternoon as they watched Lily crawl around a brightly colored playmat Edward had brought to the park. Better than I expected? She makes it easy, Edward replied, quickly moving to redirect Lily when she headed toward a large muddy puddle. A swift protective instinct. She's so smart, so curious about everything. I could watch her explore for hours. You sound like a proud father, Charlotte said, and there was something wistful, almost longing in her voice. I am a proud father, Edward said firmly, meeting her gaze, even if I'm still learning how to be a good one. Their routine continued for 6 weeks, a consistent rhythm that slowly built trust. Edward proved his unwavering commitment through his unwavering presence and reliability, and Charlotte slowly, cautiously began to trust that he wouldn't disappear again. Lily, sensing the growing harmony, thrived with the increased attention, hitting new developmental milestones almost weekly, her joy infectious. What do you think of Edward's transformation? Has he truly changed, or is he just trying to win Charlotte over? Share your theories in the comments. Part 7, A Father's Vigil. Then everything changed on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November. Edward was at his sleek office reviewing plans for a new EEC-friendly housing development when his phone rang. Charlotte's name on the caller ID made him smile. She'd started calling him directly rather than going through Grace. A small but profoundly significant step forward in their cautious reconciliation. Charlotte, is everything all right? You sound Edward! Her voice was tight with sheer panic, ragged with fear. I'm at the hospital. Lily can't breathe properly. She has pneumonia, and they're talking about putting her on oxygen. I need you here. Edward was out of his chair before she even finished speaking. Adrenaline coursing through him. Which hospital? Great Ormond Street Hospital. Edward, I'm scared. I'm on my way. Don't hang up. The drive to the hospital was the longest 15 minutes of Edward's life. Charlotte stayed on the phone, her voice shaking uncontrollably as she desperately described Lily's labored breathing and the doctor's grim, concerned expressions. By the time Edward burst through the pediatric ward doors, his expensive shirt soaked from running through the relentless rain, Charlotte was a barely controlled wreck, her composure shattered. Where is she? He demanded, his voice raw with fear. Room 7, Charlotte said, pointing down the hallway, her hand trembling uncontrollably. They're running tests. Edward found his daughter in a hospital crib looking impossibly small and fragile with an oxygen mask covering half her tiny face. Wires monitored her vital signs, blinking ominously, and the chilling sound of her raspy, strained breathing filled the sterile, silent room. Charlotte stood rigidly beside the crib, tears streaming relentlessly down her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Without thinking, Edward pulled Charlotte into his arms. She resisted for only a moment, a brief, fragile hesitation before collapsing completely against his chest, her carefully maintained composure finally utterly cracking under the immense pressure. "You should have brought her in sooner," she sobbed, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I thought it was just a cold. It should have known." "Hey," Edward said firmly, holding her tighter, his voice a steady anchor in her storm. "You're an amazing mother. This isn't your fault. Not at all. Not it." Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending pediatrician, entered the room, holding Lily's chart. "Are you both parents?" she asked, her gaze assessing them calmly. "Yes," Edward said without hesitation, his voice unwavering. And Charlotte surprisingly didn't correct him. Simply leaning into his embrace, Lily has pneumonia in her left lung, but we've caught it early. With antibiotics and oxygen therapy, she should recover fully. However, we'd like to keep her for observation for at least 72 hours, whatever she needs, Edward said immediately, his voice firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Cost isn't a factor. Over the next 3 days, Edward and Charlotte took turns, keeping a tireless vigil at Lily's bedside. Edward had Liam handle all his urgent business affairs, delegating everything, while he focused entirely on his daughter's precarious recovery. Consumed by her well-being, he slept in an uncomfortable hospital chair, survived on cafeteria coffee and vending machine sandwiches, and meticulously learned to read the complex monitors that tracked Lily's vital signs. His architectural mind now dedicated to deciphering life. On the second night, as Lily finally slept peacefully, her breathing slowly returning to a normal, steady rhythm, Charlotte found herself truly looking at Edward for the first time since their devastating breakup, seeing him with new eyes. The expensive suits had been replaced with rumpled jeans and wrinkled shirts. His usually perfectly styled hair was messy, from constantly running his hands through it in worry, and he had deep, dark circles under his eyes from relentless lack of sleep. But there was something profoundly different about him. A newfound softness, a raw vulnerability she'd never once seen before, a purity of concern. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I did," Edward replied, never taking his eyes off Lily, his gaze filled with a fierce tenderness. She's my daughter. This is where I belong. With her, the Edward I knew would have hired a private nurse and gone straight back to work, delegating this inconvenient problem. Edward finally looked at her, and Charlotte was startled by the raw intensity, the burning conviction in his emerald green eyes. The Edward you knew was an idiot who thought success was measured in contracts and profits. This Edward knows that the only success that truly matters is being the father Lily deserves, and the man you should have had beside you from the very beginning always. Charlotte felt her carefully constructed walls built so painstakingly over 16 painful months beginning to crumble slowly, irrevocably. Edward, she began, her voice thick with emotion, trembling. I love you, he said simply, the words a heartfelt confession. I never stopped loving you. Losing you was the biggest mistake of my life. But losing Lily would destroy me completely. I know I don't deserve another chance with you, but please, please don't shut me out of her life. Before Charlotte could respond, a small, tiny voice from the hospital crib captured both their attention, breaking the spell. "Da," Lily said clearly, her small green eyes focused directly on Edward, despite the cumbersome oxygen mask covering half her face. "Da!" Edward felt his heart stop completely. A sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. "Did she just?" he whispered, barely audible. "Da," Lily repeated, reaching her tiny hand toward him. A clear invitation. Edward gently took her hand in his, and Lily's small fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. An undeniable connection. "Hello, my darling girl," he said softly, his voice breaking with overwhelming emotion. "Daddy's here. Daddy's always going to be here." Charlotte watched this profoundly. Tender moment unfold between her daughter and the man she'd never truly stopped loving, and felt the last stubborn remnants of her defenses utterly collapse. Lily had made her choice. She wanted her father in her life. And if Charlotte was honest with herself, truly deeply honest, she wanted him there too. What do you think of Lily's first word? And how will this hospital visit change Edward and Charlotte's relationship moving forward? Share your thoughts below. Part 8. A New Family. From Dion 6 months later on Lily's first birthday. Edward's sleek Chelsea penthouse was completely transformed with vibrant pink balloons, shimmering streamers, and enough presents to stock a toy store. Charlotte's family, Edward's mother, Eleanor, who had flown in from Edinburgh. Liam, Grace Davies, and several close friends gathered, their faces alight with joy, to celebrate the precious milestone. Lily, now walking steadily, albeit with adorable wobbles and babbling constantly, was the radiant center of attention in her frilly pink dress and tiny, glittering tiara. She'd blossomed into a confident, happy toddler, who clearly adored her father and lit up with pure joy whenever he entered a room. "Speech!" Liam called out good-naturedly as they prepared to cut the elaborate birthday cake, his voice echoing in the lively room. Edward stood, lifting Lily gently into his arms, and looked around the room at the beaming faces of the people who mattered most in his newly aligned world. "A year ago," he began, his voice clear, filled with a profound sincerity, "I thought I had everything a man could possibly want. Success, recognition, financial security. But I was wrong. I had nothing because I didn't have what truly matters, family." He looked at Charlotte, who was watching him with tears glistening in her eyes, a soft, loving smile on her lips. "Lily has taught me that being a father isn't about providing the perfect life or waiting for the right moment. It's about showing up every single day and putting your child's needs before your own without hesitation. It's about midnight feedings and nappy changes and reading the same worn storybook 50 times because it makes her giggle." Lily babbled happily, reaching out to playfully grab at his tie, making everyone in the room chuckle with delight. "But most importantly," Edward continued, his gaze returning to Charlotte, his voice thick with raw emotion, "Lily has taught me that love isn't something you plan for or schedule. It just is. And it's worth fighting for, worth changing for, worth everything." He gently sat Lily down on the table, then turned fully to Charlotte, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. The room fell silent, holding its collective breath as he dropped to one knee, his gaze fixed on her. "Charlotte Hayes," he said, his voice steady, unwavering, despite the powerful emotion shimmering in his eyes. "You gave me the greatest gift imaginable when you gave me Lily. But the gift I want most is the chance to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of both of you." Charlotte's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob as tears freely streamed down her beautiful face, tears of overwhelming joy. "I'm not asking you to marry the man I was," Edward continued, his voice softer now, pleading. "I'm asking you to marry the man Lily has helped me become. The man who knows that true success is measured in bedtime stories and good-night kisses, in scraped knees, kissed better, and proud moments shared. He opened the box, revealing a simple but exquisitely elegant diamond ring sparkling under the lights. "Will you marry me, Charlotte? Will you let me be not just Lily's father, but your husband? Will you let us be a real family together forever?" The room collectively held its breath as Charlotte looked from the sparkling ring to Edward's hopeful, vulnerable face, then to their daughter, who was happily clapping her tiny hands as if she instinctively understood the immense importance of the moment unfolding before her. "Yes," Charlotte whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Then louder, clearer. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." As Edward, a radiant smile on his face, slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a tender, fierce embrace. Lily toddled over and wrapped her tiny arms around both their legs, as if instinctively sealing their family together, making it whole. The kiss was interrupted by the sudden flash of cameras and the exuberant cheers of their friends and family, but neither Edward nor Charlotte minded. They had found their way back to each other, not through calculated plans or business deals, but through the pure, undeniable love of their remarkable daughter. And this time, absolutely nothing would ever tear them apart. What do you think of Edward's proposal? And how amazing is it that Lily was the catalyst for it all? Share your thoughts below. Part 9, A Future Forged in Love. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had gone home, and Lily was safely tucked into her crib, dreaming peacefully, Edward and Charlotte sat on the spacious terrace of what would soon be their shared home, planning their vibrant future together, their hands intertwined. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen you at the airport that day?" Edward asked, his arm wrapped around Charlotte as they watched the distant London skyline twinkle against the night sky. "I think we would have found each other eventually," Charlotte replied, snuggling closer to his warmth, her head resting on his shoulder. "Lily wouldn't have let us stay apart forever. She's been determined to have her family together from the very beginning." "Smart girl," Edward said with a soft smile, a genuine warmth in his voice. "She gets that from her mother, and her stubbornness from her father," Charlotte added, laughing lightly when Edward pretended to look offended, a playful jab. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both reflecting on the challenging, winding journey that had ultimately brought them to this profound moment. The path hadn't been easy, riddled with misunderstandings and painful silences, and trust had been painstakingly rebuilt, slowly one day, at a time, one shared laugh, one comforting touch. But they had made it through the suffocating darkness, and against all odds, found their way back to the light. In her nursery, Lily slept peacefully, surrounded by brightly wrapped birthday presents and the boundless love of parents who had through hard-won experience learned that the best things in life are truly worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring new challenges, new joys, and countless new memories to cherish, shaping their collective future. But tonight the Sullivan family was beautifully, utterly complete. And that, after everything, was all that genuinely mattered.